Okay, so we're going to begin our second non-continuity editing lesson on Soviet montage. What do I mean by Soviet montage? Well, first we need to know the word montage. It's a French word from the verb monter, which means to assemble. That'll give you a clue as to what we mean by that. But it doesn't mean the same thing as montage sequence. I mentioned this last time in our look at temporal editing patterns. So when you hear Soviet montage, don't think of Rocky training montage. They don't mean quite the same thing. When we're talking about Soviet montage, we are talking about a particular movement within film history that's attached to a selection of filmmakers and a selection of film theory from the 1920s in Soviet Russia. So what I want you to think about thematically is that when we move from continuity editing to Soviet montage, we are essentially moving from a system of editing that emphasizes spatio-temporal relations, space and time, to a theory of editing that emphasizes the way in which meanings can be constructed in using editing like a language. A little bit of history. Soviet montage is associated with the Moscow Film School. In other words, or also known as the State Institute of Cinematography. It was established in 1919. That's just 2 years after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Soviet montage filmmaking is a school of filmmaking that revolves around a revolution, a kind of workers' revolution, inspired by the teachings of Karl Marx. These are three main filmmakers associated with the movement: Lev Kuleshov, Sergei Eisenstein, and Pudovkin. Now, what did they do in the State Institute of Cinematography? Well, it's really interesting to consider how the filmmaking and thought of Soviet montage is tied to this early practice of reassembling American films. Why? Because there was no raw film stock in the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Moscow Film School. So Kuleshov, one of the founding members of the film school, says, when it became apparent to us that American films were best in terms of their influence on the viewer, we took them for ours today. We began to analyze not only the separate shots of a film, but studied its entire construction. So they'd take a film like D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, and they would use that as the means by which they would understand the art of filmmaking, especially the way in which the rearrangement or the reassembly of shots in time could remake meanings. In many ways, the Soviet filmmakers were indebted to and respected filmmakers, American filmmakers like D.W. Griffith, but also Eisenstein in particular was very critical of D.W. Griffith's representation, he thought, of American bourgeois ideology. And it's also important to remember that D.W. Griffith is part of the dark past of American history. His film Birth of a Nation is a notoriously racist film, but also is considered his most famous film. So we have to consider that the, emergence of concrete editing principles like cross-cutting and the emergence of spatio-temporal continuity is also bound up with the problematic ideology of a figure like D.W. Griffith. What the Soviet school tried to do was to study the influence of those films, but also think about how those ideologies could be rearranged through the form of editing. One of the most famous and influential kind of lessons from the Soviet film school comes from Lev Kuleshov. It's called the Kuleshov Effect. It's something that you may or may not have heard of. It's kind of made its way into popular culture today. The Kuleshov Effect refers to the way in which meaning in film is created out of a juxtaposition rather than being contained within an individual shot. It's most famously attached to this brief cinematic kind of lesson here, where you have static images of objects followed by a neutral picture of a face. So the idea here, as you can probably imagine, is that when you juxtapose in time these images with a neutrally expressive or neutrally unexpressive face, you will synthesize those two objects into what seems like an expression that actually is not neutral. So when you have a neutral face plus the soup, you get the appearance of hunger. says the theory. When you have this neutral face plus a dead child, you get the expression of sadness. You want to read sadness into this face. And the theory says that when you have a reclining woman, as you get here, when it's juxtaposed with the neutral face, you get a new expression of lust. This is the theory. Now, you can see that what's going on here is basically an understanding of editing that's akin to the synthesis of language. One thing plus another thing juxtaposed with each other synthesizes a new thing that wasn't contained in either of those original shots, right? Eisenstein was very much devoted to this idea, but he wanted to take this idea a little bit further and tweak it a bit. When you read his essay that I assigned, A Dialectic Approach to Film Form, you'll see that he begins by saying art is always conflict. Sergei Eisenstein is a kind of polemical writer, a writer who has a big voice, who makes large claims. And he starts by not just claiming something about film, but about art in general. Art is always conflict, he says. And then he says montage is about conflict. Montage, he says, is an idea that arises from the collision of independent shots, shots even opposite to one another. And then he says something like this: montage is a dialectic. He's borrowing the term dialectic from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is borrowing the term dialectic from Hegel, a German philosopher. All we need to know about this term dialectic is that it is a kind of formal structure where one thing plus its opposite thing, when they collide, yield a new thing, right? The thesis plus antithesis equals a synthesis. It was Eisenstein's idea that this was a good model for how the production of new meanings within montage can work. Montage can create concepts, emotions, and other effects through the conflicting juxtaposition of images. And you can see that what he's saying is very much modeling the images in a sequence off of the idea that film can be like language. He says, now why should the cinema follow the forms of theater and painting rather than the methodology of language, which allows wholly new concepts or ideas to arise from the combination of two concrete denotations of two concrete objects? Once again, he's thinking about all the ways in which this new medium of film has been understood by way of comparison to the media that came before it. Is film like theater? Is film like painting? Is film like photography and time? Eisenstein is saying film, in a way, should be like language. We want to think about the ways in which new meanings can be constructed with the careful juxtaposition of images, which you can get with editing in cinema. So let's look at an example. It might be difficult to understand what he means by this, but I think it's best understood through looking at his own filmmaking. So Eisenstein's film Strike contains a very useful and shocking instance of what he'll call intellectual montage. It's a sequence in which we get a juxtaposition of soldiers being slaughtered, workers being slaughtered, with the slaughtering of a bull. And I'm going to play it for you, and I just want to warn you there is actual animal violence in this sequence. So if that bothers you, you can fast forward to the next part of the video. So Eisenstein himself will comment on this sequence and say that in Strike, the montage of killing of the workers is actually a cross montage of this carnage with the butchering of a bull in an abattoir. While the subjects are different, butchering is the associative link. This made for a powerful emotional intensification of the scene. The idea being, of course, that you have one thing and then you have another thing, and those things aren't necessarily related. They have wildly different content. But the stitching of them together, going back and forth between them, should create an associative link. That one thing is inherently like the other. In this case, the killing of the workers is like the butchering of the bull. One way to think about how this theory is different from spatial continuity, spatial temporal continuity, is that if you watch this sequence and these two juxtapositions, this juxtaposition of images, you would probably not think that this is suggesting that, hey, there is a war going on, and meanwhile, there is a bull being slaughtered. When will these two things converge, right? In other words, this is not cross-cutting, right? Even though it contains two different actions that are spliced together, in Eisenstein's words, cross-montaged, the way we watch it is not the same way we watch the D.W. Griffith film, where you have three different points of action, and then we think about the ways in which they are happening simultaneously and anticipate their convergence. One is about space and time. The other is about two things going together in a kind of meaningful synthesis. That's different, and importantly different. So I want us to go back to this idea of conflict and think about the kind of other ramifications of Eisenstein's theory. For Eisenstein, the simplest form, or simplest to understand form of conflict is between different shots. The shots of a bull being slaughtered and the shots of the workers being massacred. But conflict can mean other kinds of things. Eisenstein was a notorious storyboarder, and he would think about the shots in his films not just in terms of what they represented, that is content, but also in terms of the forms of movement that they had, the shapes, the geometric compositions that they inevitably created, and he would try to think about how to juxtapose them in order to maximize a kind of almost abstract conflict. So you'll see that he'll think about individual shots in a film called Battleship Potemkin as, say, going to the right, and then he'll have sequences of going to the left, right? Or he'll have this moment where hands go up, he'll make sure that the left hands go up, and then the right hands go up, and then go back and forth. He's thinking about conflict on a wide scale, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of graphical form. And you can see that kind of thing in this famous instance in Battleship Potemkin, where here the conflict is one between stillness and motion. So the idea here is that this simple, rapid succession of these three lion statues produces the illusion that the lions are waking up, responding to the violence that is happening around them. But the idea for Eisenstein was that the synthesis is always also a kind of conflict with the fact that we know that the lions are just statues, right? That we hold that tension in our minds, and that tension yields a kind of wildly new image of movement. A similar kind of thing here, where he would produce the effect of machine gun fire by, and I won't leave that on because I know that might bother some folks because it's flashing. He'll create the effect of machine gun fire not by simply recording a machine gun, but by creating wild alterations between dark frames and light frames to create a kind of flashing, purely through the conflict of light and dark. He'll also create things like this that seem rather excessive, but he wants to create a graphical conflict. Notice that there's a dead person on the ground, but he'll make sure to create a juxtaposition of different angles that create a sense of conflict.